Welcome to Certified Credit's Talk Data to Me podcast, where our FCRA certified experts help you tackle the latest regulations, emerging trends, and unique challenges of the mortgage industry with an intuitive, people-first approach. And of course, data. Because your business is built on more than just a score. Visit certifiedcredit.com for more information. Certified Credit helps you hone your best practices from lead generation to post-closing QC and everything in between.
This is Elizabeth Langbarton of Certified Credit's Talk Data to Me podcast, and joining me today is Kristin Messerli of experience.com. She is the VP of Strategy. How are you doing, Kristin?
Doing great. So happy to be on Talk Data to Me.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you here. Kristin is all about the numbers. Also joining us today is Nicole Mattiello, our VP of Marketing here at Certified. Hey, Nicole.
Hey, how are you?
So ladies, we're here talking today about a topic that is near and dear to not only Certified, but also to Kristin and experience.com. And that is underserved markets and the next generation of home buyer. So Kristin, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in this subject?
Yeah, so I was actually a social worker before I started working in the mortgage business or in financial services, but I worked with a lot of immigrant communities and helping them understand how to rebuild their finances or housing coordination. And it just spurred a lot of passion in me on bridging that gap. And I also grew up in the mortgage business. So I guess I've been doing this my whole life kind of, but my dad had a mortgage business. And so I then started a company called Cultural Outreach, which I sold to NAMBA a couple years ago. We did the company does a lot of financial literacy education and marketing content to better connect with young and diverse markets. But I started really focusing on the next gen consumer when I started, I think it was about 8 or 10 years ago, I was asked to speak on the topic. And I realized that as we talk about cultural differences, that is really significant when it comes to generations. And especially now when, of course, millennials and Gen Z, we've been mostly digital natives in a really pivotal time in our history of technology development. And then it's been fascinating over the last few years, just how much we've leapfrogged in terms of technology adoption in the mortgage business and in financial services overall. So I do a lot of speaking and writing on the topic of next gen consumers and how to better understand how to bridge that gap.
That's awesome. And I think it's really interesting when you talk about that comparison of not only cultural difference, but the differences between the generations. So when we're talking about that next generation of home buyer, those millennials, now the Gen Zs, how are they different from our baby boomers, our Gen X, the older millennials even?
Yeah, so it's been interesting because when I sold Cultural Outreach, I moved over to experience.com where we focus on the voice of the customer. And I've been doing more research over the last couple of years, gathering data on the next gen consumer, looking at their customer experience versus and their expectations around the customer experience versus previous generations. So we surveyed over 3,000 next gen homebuyers and found some interesting data points that I think some of them were really expected, like a preference for technology and things like that. But some of them, I was surprised by the extent to which people kind of their natural inclination was towards their customer experience, which was that of distrust and an overall skepticism. And so it's interesting because it was surprising to me, but then when I look at my own experience and talk to any friends and, people in this generation, we have become increasingly more distrusting or less trusting. And so we approach, in the data, we found that 2 in 3 next gen homebuyers said that they didn't think lenders were trustworthy or reliable. Wow. And those are people that are already in the market, either buying or just bought a home, so yeah. I can imagine the general market is even more so. And then some of the other data points that came up were around concern over whether their home would be a good investment. That was one of the top fears and concerns. And education came up as a big factor as well. So I think it was 1 in 5 next gen consumers said that they didn't feel confident in any step of the home buying process. And a lack of understanding was one of their top fears and concerns. So anyway, just all that to say, I think, when you look at the overall experience of next gen consumers in comparison with previous generations, there's a whole lot of distrust, and there's a lack of education, and there's a general feeling of like a need for empowerment. So, I mean, that kind of gets into a solution side of things, but we want to feel that we have control and transparency throughout the process.
Nicole, would you think that we're seeing this as well on the credit side, not just the customer experience and that lender experience, but not really understanding how credit works as well, and how that's impacting?
Yeah, I absolutely think that's the case, Sally. I know, just from my own side of the coin, my past history was very much involved in training new hires, for example. And a lot of times in our industry, bringing people into the credit space, they may have been often just out of high school, just out of college, had no idea how their credit report worked, had no idea what decisions were good ones versus bad. It wasn't like people were actively trying to make poor decisions.
Right.
It was really just a lack of that foundational knowledge. And I know I believe they call us the Oregon Trail generation. I'm one of those exennials that's right there on the cusp. And I can remember the days back when I was in college and free t-shirt, come sign up for this credit card. And one of the stories I always use is something I think that was impactful then, but really is not necessarily changed that much, is I had a friend who declared bankruptcy by the time college was over. And it was all because of having signed up for too many credit cards to get a free t-shirt.
Wow.
So, you're really, often people were kind of put in, they were not just a step behind or a step back, they were miles back, and now having to figure out how to navigate that path forward. And some of that I don't think is really that different. Unfortunately, I hate to say that. I mean, I'm kind of going back on the late 90s, early 2000s with that story, but at the same time, I don't think that we've seen any substantial changes in our educational system that really make an impact for young students or even beyond, right? Even to young adulthood, you're so reliant upon whatever you happen to learn from your family. So like if you were lucky enough to have a family that was pretty put together in terms of their process, and they kind of knew the right things, which again, it's generational, then it's coming from another person passed down to them, or maybe they learned the hard way or something like that. But there's really not that systemic process, I would say, that kind of helps guide people. And to me, I find that that's like the biggest concern I even have for my own kids, right? Like as they get older, they're, kind of mid-childhood here, but as they get older, helping them to navigate those decisions so they don't find they've kind of set themselves behind the pace where they'd like to be.
Well, and here is where you see then this huge gap in terms like you're teaching your kids, the parents that don't know, don't have financial literacy already, then they're not passing that down. And it's always hitting the people that are already in difficult situations. And that's what I found when I was a social worker, the people that got into horrendous credit situations have been going to, what do they call it? Like the pay, like where you get your paycheck like early.
Buy now, pay later kind of payday loan
places all the time because they needed to. And then they're the ones that are also manipulated more easily. And I go to, Banana Republic and they tried to sell me on a credit card and I'm like, no, get away from me kind of thing. And,
don't do it. I'll tell the person behind me in line.
But when I was just out of college and really could use that 20% off, then I am more likely to say, I'll sign up for that. But right now I can spare the 20%, And so this is where you get into just deeper and deeper disparities when it comes to, then it continues to prey on the people that need that 20% or need that free t-shirt,
Well, and do you think this is more of a challenge now because the next generation, your Gen Z, is more diverse than even, millennials? And so you have these underserved communities that aren't educating, and then it's only trickling down.
Yeah. And when we say underserved, we have to remember that there are generations where it really is very rooted in housing in a lot of places, but, wealth does beget wealth, and wealth is passed down from generations. And so you see, like, I actually put together some data I can pull it up in a minute, but where you look at the racial wealth gap, and it's just, of course, everyone knows that there's this huge racial wealth gap, but it's rooted in these generations that have been either excluded from the ability to buy a home through redlining practices and discrimination, that kind of thing. Or while, white Americans were able to build wealth over time, or just in general, that, like you said, the underserved communities and a lack of financial education and financial empowerment in those communities. So you're already starting from a place that's a lot further back a lot of times. And I think that makes it definitely really difficult. But overall, I mean, even I haven't seen the data on Gen Z yet, but there was a study that showed that in a basic financial literacy quiz, millennials could only answer, or 1 out of 4 millennials could answer those questions correctly. And that was like half of what the previous generation could do. And so, you're seeing that continue to decrease with age. And of course, our financial situations are becoming more and more complex. So I think that becomes very difficult.
Yeah. Looking at that financial picture as it becomes more complex, we're looking at an older generation that now has that capital to come into the market and buy homes for cash. And then you have these younger borrowers who might not be in a great position when it comes to credit or comes to their financial picture, and they're competing for what are now starter homes. So how do you see that impacting the market?
I mean, there's a lot of investors and now a lot of corporate investors that are buying up single family homes. And it really, a lot of funds trying to hedge against inflation too. And so there's been a lot of cash going into the market, even outside of just older buyers that can afford to outright buy a home. So I think that's put a huge, that's been really difficult. But I think that there's a lot of other areas that have, just with the rising cost of housing, like if you look at, I put together a chart and adjusted the numbers for inflation to compare what it was like to buy a home in 1980 versus today. And just our income has not risen anywhere near the levels that housing prices have risen. And so, you see things like even our starting income today versus starting income in 1980 is lower than it was. And if you adjust for inflation, and yet homes are like, 4 times as much versus what they were in 1980 if you are adjusting for inflation. So it's that housing value to income ratio is higher than it was in the housing bubble. Not saying we're in a housing bubble, but it's just something to recognize. Like that is really for a variety of reasons. I mean, one, you said cash investors, cash buyers, but also things like low inventory, which has a lot of reasons behind that, but that has made it very difficult for millennials or Gen Z to buy homes right now. And yet I will say that there's a lot of millennials in the market. I mean, I think the number is like 44% of millennials or 44% of home purchases today are made by millennials.
Wow. And what kind of homes are those millennials and those now Gen Z looking at?
So that's interesting. I don't have the data on like the percentage, but there has been a rise in demand for smaller, like multifamily units, so like I live in a tenant in common. And so that means that I share, it's like a condo type of thing, but because more single people are buying homes or, 1 to 2 person households are buying homes, they're interested in buying condos or like multifamily units. And so that demand has risen, but the construction hasn't risen to the level and there's like zoning laws that make it difficult in a lot of areas to build. So I think that's a really interesting area for us to explore and hopefully change some of the laws around that, because people are starting families later in life. And so a lot of younger people could buy a starter home in a place like a tenant in common or a condo, type of unit.
Yeah. I mean,
Sorry, Allie, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm on the younger side of the millennials, so I'm that tail end. So Nicole and I are kind of bookending, and I have a lot of friends that are just starting to look at home ownership. and they are looking at not tenant, and they're looking at condo situations where, they buy the unit and then they don't have to worry about the yard. They may only have 1 or 2 bedrooms. They're looking for something where it's in the city, and you can't necessarily, where we live, get that. If you're out of the city, you're moving into a single family home. So a lot of people are looking at that as an option that's affordable, because they're going to be, a quarter to a half of the price of a single family home, and they don't have to worry about all those additional responsibilities and costs.
Yeah. Where do you guys live again?
We're both in Pittsburgh.
Oh, okay.
And so, I mean, even I was going to ask you about the buying percentages of younger millennials, Generation Z, I mean, even older millennials in the West, because I know you're out in California, and home buying out there is exorbitant comparatively. I mean, I tell my friends who live out West how much I paid for our house, and they're like, I couldn't even buy a condo with that.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, no, it's crazy because I bought a home in Oklahoma, and I still have a lot of family in Oklahoma, but I bought a home in Oklahoma that was 3-bedroom, like, okay, neighborhood. And I was making 28 grand a year, and it was like,
yeah.
And now I just a year ago or so bought a home in LA, and I was like, oh man, like it was such a different perspective. But my down payment was like as much as my brother's nice 5-bedroom house, and I'm like, man, what am I doing?
It's so different. It's so different. So my sister happens to live in Denver, for example, and she and her husband, they bought their first home. I think it was last year, may have been the year before actually, but kind of to your point, Kristin, they basically had to buy a duplex. It wasn't as though they really had that many choices. If they wanted to be close to the city center, and they did for work reasons, that was just the most practical for them. But the disparity in what you could afford was just like completely shocking. And again, it was more about like, well, okay, this is going to be our starter home. This is going to be our next step. But it's maybe, how long do you even want to be there? I think sometimes these starter homes, like, they're not necessarily practical for the next 10 years. And you kind of know that going into it. And I think that kind of even changes the way you approach it in terms of, okay, well, do I just bite the bullet and go with this and hope that home values go up? And knowing how fast they've inflated, well, we know what we mean comparatively by that. The home values have gone up much further than we would have expected them to in a short period of time. Are they still going to have that value? Are you going to find people maybe underwater? I think there's questions around that. And if you're looking to kind of dip your toe in the market for the first time, I'm sure that can be something for millennials that they're kind of afraid of too.
Yeah, completely. I mean, 22% of the respondents in our survey of NextGen buyers said that they were worried their home wouldn't be a good investment. And I think that this is where, and I actually, going into the market, to buy a home, I was going to rent again. And people kept telling me, you should really look at buying a home. And I was like, you would say that because you're in the industry. So again, like distrust, but I finally did a rent versus own, and I did it over a short term. So I did it for 5 years, and I had someone, help me look at, if I put money in the stock market, if the market went way down, like what would this look like? And I still broke even after 2 years. And that's what helped me realize, like, okay, this was a good idea. This is a good idea, even in like a really conservative market. But I think that we need to see those numbers for ourselves and really be able to walk through those scenarios, because and have expertise on the market and what the market's doing. Because the other thing was, and I was just telling you about, how I was having dinner with some friends the other night, and they're like, we missed the boat on buying a home, and now the market's doing this and that. And I was like, let me pull up my data.
Let me show you my Excel chart.
Yeah, let me talk data to you. And so it was really funny, but it was cool because I just released this report, the 2022 State of the Industry Halftime Report, which I would love for people to check out. We interviewed 25 plus experts. And then I also we did a bunch of other research too, but looking at what economists are showing across all sources that I could find, the housing prices are still going up. They're just not going up to the level that they did last year. Or the last couple of years. So we're, while last year was like 19% increase in home value. This year, we're expecting to see 6%. So in comparison, it's not great. And, but on its own, it's fine. You know,
that would be good under normal circumstances. Yeah, it's kind of, I think we've come to expect something different because we lived through such an unusual period the last few years, right? Mm-hmm. And I think people, it's especially if that's the first time they started paying attention. If you were maybe just kind of about to start on your home ownership journey and you just really started focusing on it, and it's not been something you historically were interested in, 4 or 5 years ago, all of this can seem a lot more frightening, perhaps. And again, especially with that. One of the things Allie and I were actually talking about the other day is, how few people, even just from a general economy standpoint, really understand the inner workings of what's happening in our environment. Even when you hear someone explain it or try to go through it. And ironically, I actually noticed Rob Christman's been spending a lot of time on kind of talking through some of those things lately. And I think it's great because so few people really necessarily had that kind of experience. And I gave her the example that, like, for example, I went to college for music education. I didn't have to take any kind of econ class. That wasn't a course requirement or anything of the sort. So, what percentage of our population really understands even the terminology that we're dealing with here? Yeah, let alone like how we talk about
financial literacy. That's like a different level.
And it becomes a question when someone goes to buy a home, whose responsibility is it to educate the borrower? Because we talk about how it's a systemic issue, but as an industry, what can we do? Who is responsible for that? Is it the credit partner of a lender? Is it the lender? Is it, us working with government agencies? Who really has to own that responsibility? And I think that's one of the challenges we're facing right now is we don't know whose responsibility it is. And so the borrower sometimes, depending on, what their life situation is being left in the dark. And then we end up with a situation like 2008.
I think, I would like to say that most people that win in this market, like I work a lot with lenders, the loan officers that are really winning are the ones that are empowering home buyers and are like empowering their communities and doing a bunch of education proactively and putting it into their process. But that's still a limited population. And I do think it needs to be like understood and honestly, probably it needs to be required, but in addition, I think it should be required that we have some basic financial literacy in high schools. We shouldn't be taking an, economy class for the first time when it comes to college, we should be learning about all of that. And I think for only people that are like, for me, total nerd, I watch YouTube videos. YouTube like feeds me, here's what's happening in the economy all the time. And I watch those. But even with that, I had a totally different perspective on what was happening in the housing economy than when I actually did the research myself. And then I realized like, okay, it's not as doom and gloom as I had been hearing about in these videos, because everyone has their own, I don't know, the reason that they're doing it. And
what kind of resources are you using whenever you are doing that more exploratory research and looking at what industry experts are saying?
So first it was cool because I've never done anything this way before, but Dave Savage, who I collaborated with on the project, had started interviewing a bunch of industry experts. And then I jumped in and did a few, and then also just went back and listened to everything everyone said, and then like categorized everything and put it together. But then outside of that, I go to places like Urban, what's it called? It's like Urban, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the time. It's a real Urban Institute. I think they have really, really great data. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies has really great data. There's a lot of places like that, looking at Pew Research and things, and then pulling that data together and seeing what is consistent and why different things might be outliers, so that then you can interpret the data across the board versus just hearing this one person's perspective or one, influence coming at you.
Right. Right. So looking at everything that's happening in the market right now, let's rewind a little bit. How did the pandemic change the home buying process for this next generation of home buyers?
So I feel like, it's like this in all industries, I think, but we really leapfrogged in a lot of ways, the way that we approach any kind of purchasing decision. For example, Apple Pay wasn't as much of a thing, but then when cash became dangerous, we started using Apple Pay everywhere, and that became normalized. But when it comes to buying a home, virtual home tours became very normalized, and filling out a loan app. I mean, I think next gen consumers were already pushing for this, but now it's become not just an expectation, but like for all generations, everyone is expecting a digital loan application, and so I think there's some elements there. E-closings really took off, which was really cool to see. So Ron and e-closing, hybrid closings, all of that. And trying to think about what other areas there, anywhere that you could increase efficiency and digitize the process has increased a lot. Oh, a huge area was video meetings. So instead of, a lot of people still went in person to an office, and now it's expected that you'll be over Zoom. And a lot of people just do phone calls, but I do always encourage everyone to do Zoom meetings, because you build rapport by looking at someone in the eyes. And on Zoom, you can also invite other family members, because for a lot of millennials and Gen Z, they have like a parent or significant other who they want to be involved in the process, and makes them feel more confident. And, a Zoom meeting allows them to have that kind of collaboration. So those are the big areas I would say have changed through the pandemic.
Yeah. And I think we were talking about it before all of this, but the number of people that now, before they bought their home, they didn't even see it. They just they scrolled through, they did what were there, like the Google tours where you click from place to place and you walk throughout. And so when we're looking at that experience, personally, as more of a digital native, I found that, something like that is very applicable, especially when you're moving to a new city, or you don't have necessarily the time to go and see that in person because it might be, an hour and a half away on the other side of town. So I personally believe we're going to continue to see that. Is that what you also are seeing in your data, that this has become the expectation? We're moving forward in this digital world.
Oh, definitely. Another area, I think blockchain is changing the way that we are approaching things, even being able to, the kind of virtual tours that can be done now. People are able to buy across, in a different city. And I think that has become more normalized and easier. I interviewed Jim Park, who knows a lot about that space, and that interview, you can watch all of these interviews. And that one I think was really interesting. I'm so new to understanding blockchain and crypto and all of that. But so I asked, I think, kind of dumb questions, but it was really interesting. But yeah, I think that opens the door of possibility to so many other areas. He talked about using the metaverse to tour homes across the world, and how then being able to put your down payment and move forward. That's just like decreased in the amount of time by so much, just by using things like blockchain. So I'm really interested to see how that develops over time too.
That's a really interesting call out too, because I think, we did see and I think there's still a lot of it too, that within the context of the pandemic, people started working remotely. You have a lot of those people out there that are still going to consider themselves now a digital nomad, a gig economy, that kind of thing, where they have the ability to be more flexible. And hey, I want to look at a place, in London. Okay, well, I don't have to necessarily get on a plane. And I think that that's a shift in mentality that's for, those of us that maybe didn't necessarily grow up. I grew up in that analog age, right, originally. And so it is a little bit more of an adjustment, but I could even feel myself pulling along with that. Like, okay, I'm more accepting, I'm more open to something like that. Whereas, pre-pandemic 5 years ago, that would have felt so foreign and like, what? I'd have to be crazy. So it's really interesting, I think, how that has changed people's perceptions so much. Just the difference in experience that we've had over the last couple of years has really fast forwarded our industry light years ahead of where you might have expected it to be.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'm interested to see how careers change and develop too, because of probably the changes happening in tech and all of that. But I think there was this big resignation where, you know, where people wanted to work at places that they felt that they had more flexibility and all of that. And I think now that is available in most jobs, or at least a lot of jobs or white collar jobs. And I think that has changed a lot how people approach what types of careers that they pursue. So
I think that changes the types of homes they approach too. So, you know, we were looking at a study by Cleaver that they did back in March of 2021. And at that point, the average home size for a millennial was 1,700 square foot, which if you have a family of two, you just have, you know, two partners, you don't really think about that's enough space. Like if you're both working from home, you can kind of find a dedicated space. But now, as we look towards this remote and hybrid workforce, they're saying they're looking at homes that are about 2,400 square foot. That's a 41% increase. So that changes not only the buying behavior, but the homes that they're looking at.
Totally.
And will this continue to shape what we're seeing, you know, as we move on? So what happens when they start having a family and need to move into a larger space that not only has an additional bedroom, but now has two offices?
I can tell you from homeschooling, I can give you a real direct answer on that one. It gets chaotic, right? Like the people, you know, even myself, we have a relatively large home, and the upstairs is 2,200 square feet. The downstairs, my husband had been working towards finishing for quite a few years and slow rolled me a little bit. Well, guess what? The pandemic comes in and bam, that thing had to get finished because we're all over each other all the time. We were way too much in each other's space. And so things that you were content with in your home became like, okay, we either have to make this decision where we're going to do this, we're going to finish it off, or do we want to move? Like, kind of that TV show, Love It or List It, right? We kind of felt that crux here because of how so much had changed. Now, obviously, kids are back in school. People aren't necessarily on top of each other quite in the same way that we all were, you know, a short 24 months ago plus. But I do think that it affects buying behaviors because you start to wonder, well, what might I find myself in that scenario again?
Yeah,
you know, God, let's hope not. But I mean, you're kind of looking at it a little bit pragmatically and saying, okay, well, I have to make a decision that's going to work for a while.
Yeah.
And actually, Kristin, one of the questions I had, I don't know if you have data on it, but I'm kind of curious with regards to like the next generation of home buyers, you know, beyond just like the things along the lines of square footage, are there other buying behaviors that have changed where they're drastically looking for, you know, a different number of bedrooms, or open concept is out because, man, we all need our own personal space now? Like, are there any trends like that we're kind of seeing begin to take shape, or was that more transitory just with the environment we were in, do you think?
I should write a follow-up article, because I wrote an article about the changing behavior of millennials and what types of homes they buy, how they think about buying and all that when the pandemic hit. And it was really funny because all of that was like how we are good with small spaces and we want to be very transient. A lot of people in that population. I mean, there's the whole like van life movement, all that kind of stuff, but there comes a point, and I was actually in the process. I didn't live anywhere at the moment the pandemic hit. I was like living from Airbnb to Airbnb, going to different cities. And then the pandemic hit and I was like, oh, like, where do I want to be? You know? And I think it, you know, when it hits the fan, like, where's my community and, you know, all of that. And I think that's an example of me and a small percent of the population. But I think for everyone, there's definitely a perception shift where you think like, what do I value and where do I want to be? So of course I rushed back to LA and I went from renting Airbnbs to buying a home, like total opposite.
Yeah.
But I'm like, I know where I want to have roots. And I think for a lot of people, they homeschooled their kids and they were working in the same space as their partner. And they were like, you know what, I really value having more space, and I need to have an outdoor space, and I need to have a solid office space, and so everyone shifted in that regard. So I don't have the data, but I am very certain that people are looking for different things when they look at homes now versus they did, 2 years ago.
Well, do we think that it kept that, they said like the average time in a home was like 6 to 7 years in that starter home. Do we think that's changed now because of all the shifts that have happened?
So that is interesting. Homeownership tenure has increased, and I don't know over what period of time. Let me see if I can find it, but it's that was something that I was surprised to see, and it caused it. I think some of it is the low inventory, but okay, here we go. In 2007, the average tenure was 5 to 7 years, and it's increased to 11 to 13 years, especially in places like California. But so it might be some of that, like knowing what's out there and that it's going to be difficult to buy. But yeah, I think that that's something interesting to note.
That's really interesting, because I think when I looked at a starter home, I went, okay, I need something that's going to live like 10 to 15 years. But actually at the beginning of the pandemic, I was like, okay, maybe this is a 5-year home. Maybe this is a 6-year home because of the space. And so I just was interested in getting your opinion there on that. And Nicole,
I would imagine that would happen. So, I mean, look at that. Cause I know a lot of people were thinking like, okay, I got to upgrade or get out of this kind of space, so, and a lot of buyers came into the market for that reason. But yeah, so that, and I'm sure in Pittsburgh versus, I know Pittsburgh has a strong housing market, but it's going to be very different there versus parts of California.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nicole, I know you had several questions that you had for Kristin. So what did you want to discuss?
I snuck a few in while we were going. But one of the things I guess that I'm curious, Kristin, if you've encountered or if you have any thoughts about is I have heard a lot of advice, different kind of guidance to LOs saying, hey, don't worry too much about these deals that you're getting done today. Give it 6 months, give it a year. These buyers are going to come back. They're going to refi. I'm curious, do you sense that that's something that's even doable for a lot of these millennial buyers? Do they have the financial resources and availability to consider something like a refi so close on the heels of just having made a purchase?
I think that if they are, that's a good point. I don't know whether they would have the financial resources to go there, but I think that there is an expectation that rates will drop a little bit again, and there's going to be another wave of refis, but I don't think it should be the focus or an expectation that that's like going to be the new focus for business. I think millennials and especially next gen consumers are going to continue to come into the market, and that is going to need to be the focus of lenders moving forward. It's just like, how do I capture more of the purchase market? That said, I mean, like we talked about the affordability, but April was Black Knight said it was the least affordable, or no, it was May, least affordable market in like 16 years. Wow. And so, financial resources are going to be constrained for most people. And I think the focus needs to be, how do I not only help the purchase market, get into homes, but also, and next gen consumers think about their process, but also how do we help them manage their wealth better? So maybe that is like expecting a refi down the road. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's something about, a rehab type of situation, or just looking at how they can manage their wealth beyond just getting into the home.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And I think it's interesting you call that out too, because a lot of the things that we kind of have tried to focus on internally are how do we help provide some of that educational content for, whether it's the LO or whether they use that, the intent honestly is for them to use that with their borrower. That's part of why we're creating it. It's really that further financial literacy premise there. So I guess along with that, one of the other things that Ali and I have been talking about is like where do consumers go today to learn? And you mentioned like you're watching YouTubes, for example, and where are they going today? Where I know a lot of us in the industry, we spend a fair amount of time on LinkedIn, but are customers there, from a consumer standpoint? Probably not. You're probably going to be more likely to find them on a YouTube, maybe on a Facebook, on a TikTok, dare I say it. And, how do we get that content? I think that educational content out there and picked up and of interest to somebody so that we can actually help move that conversation forward. Because one of the things I know we agree on, we all kind of talked about this before, it's really great that the industry as a whole kind of sees that there's this gap here that we need to do better. But I think we're all kind of, a little full circle to our original question here. I think we're all aware of it, but we're not sure where to start. And, what are the next right steps in terms of communicating this message out?
Yeah.
So first of all, I think it was interesting. The last time I did the survey of NextGen consumers was last September, but 56% said their go-to source was YouTube and on social media. So the first source is by far Google. Like they go to Google for, any question. I go to Google for literally every stupid question I have. And, but so whatever.
Almost a skill at this point. You have to be able to Google to get
I'm a really good Googler. I've said that for years. I'm like super awesome at it.
And Google's gotten so good. I was just planting a bunch of stuff, like learning how to garden and stuff, and I just Google, what do I do with this plant? What do I do? Like every question I have. And, so it's whatever's going to pop up. And there's a lot of, NerdWallet, Smart Asset, all these kinds of places come up a lot, but I think then it's friends and family, and then it's social media. So social media is in the top 3. And when we look at social media, YouTube is by far the first place people go to for financial questions overall and homeownership education. And I mean, if you look at the chart that I have, it's like YouTube, and then way down there, it goes into Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and I think LinkedIn from there. But, and then TikTok was 12% said that they go to TikTok for home buying information or financial education. And that was last September. So I imagine that's a lot more. And I was shocked when I saw that, because I wasn't even on TikTok last September,
Yeah, me either.
And
I would imagine that's where some of that distrust comes from, though, because growing up in a generation where there's all kinds of information coming at you from YouTube, from TikTok, from your parents, and things are constantly changing. Can I believe that TikToker who told me that now is the time to buy a home, whether or not they're an industry expert? Because you really, other than putting your NLMS number on your TikTok, how are we to know what you do, who you are, that you are a loan officer, that we should trust you?
Yeah, I actually think, I've been interviewing some of the like financial influencers, on Instagram and TikTok. It's been really interesting. All the ones I've interviewed have been, loan officers, but there's a few people that I follow that are like, attorneys or something like that. And I think that gives them, that kind of credibility. There's another girl that I guess I did interview her. She is not a loan officer. She's not certified in anything that I know of, but she's educated. And I think people trust someone who's going to give them a lot of information and give them information that they understand. So I don't know that it matters as much. I think it matters to some degree, but people are listening to people because they trust them over time, no matter who they are, really. And I think I didn't really trust. Just because my parents used a financial planner, I'm not going to trust that financial planner. That kind of thing has changed a lot in the way that who we approach and what kind of trust we put in people. But one thing that's interesting, just as a side note, I've focused so much on financial institutions and the financial industry around distrust over the last few years, thinking a lot of it had to do with the financial crisis and things like that. We were entering adulthood during or right after. But I looked recently at distrust across all industries, and it has fallen across the board in every area. So you think of, media, of course, we have way less trust in media today. We have way less trust in government institutions, in faith-based institutions. It's really technology. It's really interesting to see where we've fallen. And then that also comes to play with finances. But I think, while that is a little bit scary to think about who we trust and how we navigate a society where everyone is distrusting. But I think it's also empowering in a way, or needs to be empowering to consumers, that we're not just going to follow whoever tells us something. We're pulling information from this TikTok person and this friend and this, financial advisor to make a smart decision for ourselves, hopefully.
Yeah. That makes sense. Because I think as consumers, don't we do that probably on a daily basis with a lot of things? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I rarely only read one article on a topic. I probably am going to read, anywhere from definitely 5 to maybe 10, depending upon what the topic is, before I decide that, okay, I've formulated my own opinion out of reading all these different sources. And they, they may all have their own kind of, viewpoint or take on it. But so I feel that I can kind of look at all that, synthesize the information. Now I have an opinion myself. So that's kind of interesting, because that was one of the things I've really wondered is, from our standpoint as an organization, and we're trying to figure out the ways to put this content out there and have it be consumable and of interest, right? Like I said, my background, education, man, people have attention spans about this big. So it's like, how do we get the most information into people's hands that want it and are ready for it and are looking for it, and in a way that they're going to actually want to engage with, and that it feels like, hey, this is beneficial to me, it's worth my time. And so just personally, that was one of those things I was interested in. Where is that trending? Because I do feel like your point, I never even would have thought of getting on TikTok last year. I was like, no way. And then now I'm like, man, I'm behind the times. I guess I got to get on TikTok, So so here I am, and Allie's kind of leading me, sends me a TikTok every once in a while. But it's kind of an interesting platform, and it's interesting to consider where that'll even be in 2 years. And it's always better when you're ahead of that curve, right? As compared to coming afterwards. And there's maybe so many people out there already. It's just a lot of noise, and then you're not really reaching your audience.
Yeah. Well, I think, to your point of we have so much information, there's information overload. And so that does push people out sometimes, but it doesn't mean that we need to not participate in providing information. I think a lot of people see that and they're like, what am I going to add to this conversation? Well, you're going to add another trustworthy person to anybody that and so, but I think the areas that people are looking for in right now, what's trending in terms of types of information consumed is what we talked about with video, short video. We do have short attention span, so short pieces of content. I still think, blogs are irrelevant because we are, like you said, reading that kind of thing, but using different forms of content. And then having the personalization when you can, like if you can have tools available or anything that empowers the consumer to be able to put in their information to understand their personal situation, that's really powerful as well.
Absolutely. So Kristin, as we are nearing the end of our conversation together, what are a couple of items that you think loan officers, financial institutions, mortgage industry should take away from this next generation of homebuyers? What do they need? How can we support them?
Yeah. So
the puppies are here.
I apologize.
They're curious too. They're just,
I know, they want to know.
Hey, I want to know. This is an
yeah, exactly. One trend we didn't talk about is how much we all love our dogs. So they got their voice in here. So I put together this model recently that's like 3 elements in a pyramid of customer experience. And the base one I say is education. I think education is really key to helping anyone feel safe, and education would mean like putting stuff out there, but also even being transparent and helping people understand what the process is, whatever you're providing. So education. The second one is empathy. And when I say empathy, I mean like helping using video, for instance. That's a great way that people build empathy and trust. And then empathy can also mean like touching base with consumers. So as part of experience.com, one of the areas I'm really passionate about that we offer now is not just a post-close survey, but also touching base with the consumer automatically at meaningful touch points. And I think for a consumer who is highly anxious and uncertain and all of these things, to be able to have a quick touch point with their provider at these certain touch points, that makes a difference for me to feel like calm and like I'm connected with my provider. So that empathy is really, really important. And then ultimately at the top of that pyramid would be empowerment. So me feeling like I feel empowered with the information you provided, with the connection that I have with you, and to make a smart decision for myself. And so all of that, builds trust with the consumer. And I would say if you make sure that you use that as a framework, lens through which you build your customer experience, you will always win with next gen consumers.
Well, that's awesome. And I think that really gives us a framework to move forward, not only at our organization, but for our customers, for our partners throughout the industry, for our industry friends, because I know we're all in the same boat. And if we work together, we can really make this a good experience for the next generation of home buyers. So thank you, Kristin, so much for joining us. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Nicole, as well, for hopping on today and joining us for Talk Data to Me. Now, Kristin, if somebody wanted to get in contact with you, what is the best way to get a hold of you?
First of all, this was so much fun. You guys are awesome. And I, again, love the name of the podcast. So thanks for having me. But yeah, if someone wants to get in touch with me, LinkedIn is the best way. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I'm also always putting out new content and data. But you could also email me directly at kmesserli@experience.com.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll say every time I see a post from Kristin, it always has one of these different surveys or one of the different studies that she's put together. And it's really helpful, especially as someone who's newer to the industry, to get to know what's happening and understand, how do we help these borrowers out and how do we continue to evolve? So thank you, Kristin.
Thank you so
It's
much.
Wonderful.
Good
Thanks.
to see you guys.
Good to see you too. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to Certified Credit's Talk Data to Me podcast. With over 35 years of industry experience, Certified Credit is your multifaceted mortgage solutions partner. Learn how our commitment to passionate service, innovative products, and superior technology create a more profitable and efficient lending environment for our clients at certifiedcredit.com. Certified Credit, more than just a score.